put tonight's lesson in context, we have really three major sections to the book. Some would say only two, but I think three is a little more logical. The first is chapters 1 through 8 that talk to us about the righteousness of God. They deal with the sin of all men and women, of the salvation that has been provided for us as a free gift, not of works, lest any should boast. And then the sanctification or change that has taken place in our life or lives by virtue of that saving work and our faith in Jesus Christ. So the righteousness of God is really that first big theme. Then we move on to, well, I'll say the faithfulness of God, chapters 9 through 11. We often refer to that as a parenthesis because the content shifts very dramatically there. But Greg Curris reminded us that it's really not correct to refer to it as a parenthesis or, a little side issue. It is really integral to what Paul is presenting here, because when we learn in the first 8 chapters that the gospel of redemption is offered to all men and women, Gentiles and Jews, without restriction, it very naturally should and does raise the question about, well, what about all the promises God made to the nation of Israel? Have they been supplanted? Are they irrelevant in the sense as a chosen people of God now that the church is the focus of God's revelation and ministry? And the answer is no, they have not been set aside. God still has a plan for the nation of Israel. And this is really sort of the crux of this whole replacement theology we hear about, where some teach that the church is now the recipient of all of the unfulfilled promises to the nation of Israel. We believe that's incorrect, and those 3 chapters deal with that. And now we're going into really the final section, chapters 12 through 16, that are talking about our service for God. We're making a shift. The first 11 chapters are very theological, and there's some complicated issues there. We've dealt with a number of them, at least, in terms of the basics in our series, but a 15-minute message on a whole chapter of Romans can't begin to do justice to the content. So we've got those early chapters, deeply theological, and now we're getting some practical information, practical consequences. Really what Paul is saying here, and I'm sure many of you can recite the first couple of verses of Romans 12, so you know where we're headed with this. But Paul is laying out the practical ramifications of our full salvation. Because we have been saved, as we have been, chapters 1 through 8, then there are going to be consequences to that. Verse 1 includes, we mentioned last week, I think we said, not last week, the last time I spoke, which was on chapter 8, I mentioned that there are 13 times in the epistle when the word therefore occurs. And it's sort of a trite little saying, but it's correct, that when you see the word therefore, you want to ask why the word is there for, or what it's there for, because there's a consequence or a result that's in view. And in this case, Paul is going to tell us about the logical consequences of the salvation we enjoy. First part of the book, theological. Now it's practical. We see the same kind of division or approach in Paul's writings, particularly in the book of Ephesians, where the first 3 chapters are very theological, a lot of deep stuff there. And then chapters 4 through 6 are the practical consequences, where he starts talking about this is how you should walk or how you should conduct yourselves because of what we learned in the first part of this epistle. I think tonight, for sake of time, And because this chapter is familiar to us, I've just got highlights. Again, it's a highlights reel. We're just going to point out some really significant things in this chapter as we read it together. And I think we have time to read the whole chapter to start off with. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. For I say, through the grace given to me, to everyone who is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, as God has dealt to each one a measure of faith. For as we have many members in one body, but all the members do not have the same function, so we, being many, are one body in Christ and individually members of one another. Having then gifts differing according to the grace that is given to us, let us use them. If prophecy, let us prophesy in proportion to our faith. Or ministry, let us use it in our ministry. He who teaches in our teaching. He who exhorts in exhortation. He who gives with liberality. He who leads with diligence. He who shows mercy with cheerfulness. Let love be without hypocrisy. Abhor what is evil. Cling to what is good. Be kindly affectionate to one another with brotherly love, in honor giving preference to one another, not lagging in diligence, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord, rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation, continuing steadfastly in prayer, distributing to the needs of the saints, given to hospitality. Bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice, and weep with those who weep. Be of the same mind toward one another. Do not set your mind on high things, but associate with the humble. Do not be wise in your own opinion. Repay no one evil for evil. Have regard for good things in the sight of all men. And if it is possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. Beloved, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. Therefore, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him a drink, for in so doing you will heap coals of fire on his head. Do not overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. So let's go right back to the first verse. And I think in verse 1, I have my own little outline here. The key is serve sacrificially. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And there's some key words here that sort of lay this out principle for us. One is the word beseech, which means it tells us that Paul is not here making a suggestion that we can either accept or reject, to follow or not. Beseech means to call upon, to admonish, and there's a little bit of a scolding element to an admonishment. There's some teeth to it. To beg, to entreat, or to implore. In other words, Paul is saying, this is a really big deal for all of us. So he is beseeching them regarding their service. So it's telling us that Paul attaches really great importance to this matter. And everybody, all of the readers back then when it was written, and us today, we should take this matter seriously. We are beseeched. And then it talks about presenting our bodies as living sacrifices. Now, in some cases in the New Testament, the word body can mean just what we would think, our physical body. And there are lessons to take from that meaning of the word. It means my hands and my feet, my lips, they should all be devoted to service for the Lord. But the word bodies can mean something more than that. It can really refer to the whole of our being. In other words, you're giving it everything you've got. Your brains, your intellect, your time, and your bodies. It's a package deal. And really what Paul is saying here is the Lord should get it all. He should get all of it. It speaks of a total commitment. Then we have this word living sacrifice. And, so we often would think of the word sacrifice, or at least in a biblical sense, if we talk about sacrifice, it's quite possible that we think back correctly to the sacrifices of the Old Testament, where an animal had to die. But Paul's saying, you're not going to die over this, right? You're going to be alive, but you're going to be making sacrifices. In other words, we're going to be giving up. We're called to give up things that are important to us. If they aren't important to us, they aren't sacrifices, right? And I think that, unfortunately, the question for us is not, am I sacrificing enough? The question really is, am I sacrificing anything at all? And I think that for many Christians today, they see their Christian faith and involvement, attendance at church, whatever it might, as something that they tack on to life as long as it doesn't cause conflicts, If I have to, it's a great day, I have to work in the garden, so I'm not going to go to church. Or friends have invited us over for a party. We're going to do that instead of, what kind of sacrifices are we making? I have actually a little folder I have with little sermon ideas or things I ought to think through. And one of them is, do I sacrifice anything? Truly sacrifice, give up anything for the Lord? That's an important question for all of us to ask. And then, and this is incredibly important, he refers to this kind of living sacrifice as our reasonable service. And maybe it even is in your center column notes here. The other way that can be phrased is rational service. In other words, the only rational response, if we understand the scope of the salvation which God has provided for us, and understand the blessing that we enjoy because it is not of works, it is given by the grace and mercy of God alone and based solely on the work of Christ. And because his work is perfect, our salvation is perfect. And we see that the only rational conclusion we can make or response we can make is to serve him completely. And it's important that we understand that, and I think the words are significant here when we think of them in light of those first 8 chapters of the epistle, because we are not serving to earn our salvation. We are serving in gratitude for our salvation, right? So, verse 1, serve sacrificially. Then verse 2, I titled, think differently. We think differently. Biblically, we are to reject the world's standards, its beliefs, and its actions, and its reasoning, its response to being challenged. And we can look around us today, if we watch the news, and we don't want to do too much of that because it's just depressing, but we recognize what a terrible moral morass our world is in. And we want to have nothing to do with that. In a sense, what the world considers normal and acceptable and right is a roadmap for us of what to avoid. Now, Paul acknowledges in this verse that this is a pressure point, that this is a challenge. I went and I pulled out, I don't know how many of you ever read the J.B. Phillips translation. I don't know if it's a translation or a paraphrase, but It's certainly one of the earliest easy read New Testaments, I guess, so I call it a paraphrase. But I looked up his phraseology for verse 2, and he says here, don't let the world don't let the world around you squeeze you into its own mold, but let God remold your minds from within. Don't let the world around us squeeze you into its own mold. I saw a little news story today about what happens if you let a pumpkin grow inside a Halloween mask. And what it does, and you peel the mask off, and the pumpkin inside has opened up to the inside dimensions and look of that Halloween mask. That mask conformed that pumpkin as it grew. And that, of course, is one of the problems we face, is all through our lives, the world is trying to manipulate us and get us to sacrifice what the Lord tells us we should do and how we should respond, and wants to squeeze us into its own mold. And we're told that this transformation of our mind, be transformed by the renewing of our minds, it tells us that there's something from within, it's in our minds, that everything starts with our thinking, doesn't it? What we give our priorities to, the opportunities for service that I accept or reject, whatever, it starts inside. And what we're told is that we have to revise our moral standards. We have to revise our priorities. We have to revise our way of thinking. We need to see everything through a biblical lens, not a worldly lens. I came across a quote I've mentioned a couple of times in the last month or so that I was reading a little book about C.S. Lewis, and there was a wonderful quote from him that I had never seen before. He said this, I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. By it I see everything else. And what Lewis was saying at that latter part of his life was, my Christian faith is not just personal to me, and it does not just enlighten me, it sheds light on everything, explains what's going on around me and how I ought to respond to it. Now, such transformation to become really biblical thinkers, as opposed to worldly thinkers, is certainly a challenge, isn't it? And in fact, we'd say it's impossible apart from the work of God in us, but we've got that, don't we? Paul in 1 Corinthians, where he's dealing with sin in the camp, we would say, he says this in chapter 6. He recites this list of sins, which are apparently still evident in the assembly, and he says, and such were some of you, past tense, but you were washed, but you were sanctified, but you were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and by the Spirit of our God. He says, you've been changed. And those words, washed, sanctified, and justified, all have a different sense. Washing is forgiveness from the sin, from our filth. Sanctification is being set apart. In other words, we have a new purpose in life. We're a set apart people. And then justified, we've been pronounced clean before God, the judge of all the world. Wonderful transformation has taken place, and we're to live like that kind of people, and we have been given the Holy Spirit to assist us in that. Then in verses 3 through 8, my heading is think soberly and serve the church. Especially in our worship, it is important to see ourselves for what we are, and that is sinners who fail to meet God's standards, unworthy of his attentions, unworthy of the salvation which he has provided. And so we will sing, and I think appropriately, but I'm going to put an asterisk by it. Would he devote that sacred head to such a worm as I? Or some versions now say, for sinners such as I. Or we also sing, I'm only a sinner saved by grace. And we understand that, right? But I remember one of my teachers saying, the only day you should be able to say, I'm only a sinner saved by grace, is the day you were saved. And you would better not be able to say that now, not truthfully, because God, once he saves us, starts changing us. And we are a gifted and empowered people who are to be growing in spiritual things right through our lives. So I was only a sinner saved by grace, but now I should be something different. And in these verses, Paul is saying, keep that in mind, please. I want you to think carefully about yourselves. I don't want you to have an inflated view of your importance and your talents or abilities, but nor do I want you to think you have nothing to give. We occasionally cross paths with someone who say, I'm just a simple person. I have nothing to give the Lord. I have nothing to give the assembly of any purpose. And that's a lie of Satan. And he goes on now to talk. It's interesting when he's talking about practical service. What does he focus on first? Spiritual gifts. Now, this is not one of the group of verses that give us the most comprehensive view of what spiritual gifts are, but it's an important one. And he goes into the fact that, we're all a little different, but we're all one body, and we are to be serving one another with our gifts. For sake of time, we'll move on. So this is think soberly and serve the church. And I think in that little section, the focus is indeed on the local church within the body. And then he goes on in verses 9 through 21 and says, I want you to behave like transformed beings. And this is really a laundry list of things we should be doing. I'm still reading in Deuteronomy and sort of the recap of the law and social guidance that was given to the Lord's people just before they were going into the land. And it's just a reminder of all kinds of things that were to characterize the Israelites in contrast to the people who were currently in that land. So this is our laundry list. This is our Deuteronomy list. Verse 9, no hypocrisy. No hypocrisy. Judy and I were talking the other night. We'd watched this little news story about a politician who made a statement. And then the news company said, oh, but here's a video of him saying exactly the opposite 2 years ago. And you think, what's going on here? I said to Judy, you'd think the politicians would learn that there's videotape. Spiritually speaking, there's videotape. God knows our every move, our every thought, our every desire. And many today will say or do anything to get what they want, to achieve their goals, to avoid conflict. We are not to be inconsistent people. We are to adopt godly characteristics and goals and then act on them consistently as best we can. No hypocrisy. Verse 10, love the brethren. I won't take time to go over that. If you want some reminders there, go to our YouTube channel and listen to Joe's Sunday message again, because it was a great one. A lot to think about in terms of the practical ways we express love for the brethren. Verse 12, and obviously I'm skipping a lot here. I'm just picking up key phrases that impressed me. One, steadfast in prayer. Why should we be steadfast in prayer? Well, first of all, because God has commanded it. He has laid out for us the importance of prayer and commanded us to be faithful in it. But it is also a reflection of the fact that we know our own limitations. There are things There are needs we see that we can meet, and if we can, we should. But there are a lot of needs we can't meet, not ourselves. They're beyond us. Over and over again, in Deuteronomy, a phrase that repeats itself over and over again, often multiple times in one chapter, talks about what the Lord has done for Israel. It says he worked by a mighty hand and with an outstretched arm. And there are lots of times when we need that mighty hand and that outstretched arm. And that's available to us through prayer. Verse 13 tells us that we're to meet practical needs. If I see a practical need, particularly within the body, I'm not supposed to send an email to one of the trustees and say, hey, you might want to do something here. That's not our first line. And we might do that, but the first question should be, can I address that need? Me. And if we can, we do it. And that's not a responsibility of just select believers, but for all of us. And particularly within the body. How is anyone outside of this fellowship going to know about the deep needs of the people in it? We're the ones that see that. This is something we deal with within the family of God. Then verse 13 also says to be hospitable. Now, I think I'm correct in saying that since COVID, hospitality has changed, right? We couldn't get together for a while, and now I think we're hesitant to get together. I think that's sort of a lingering effect, but hospitality is a big deal. And I shared in our elders meeting Tuesday night, I shared a comment about a little booklet that Alex Strauch wrote. I think we might do well to resurrect that and take ourselves through that study. The original title for the book was Using Your Home for Christ. And a couple of years later, he retitled it The Hospitality Commands, to better emphasize the fact that we are commanded to be hospitable. And we all know why or how hospitality is important, because when we are shown hospitality, we come away saying, wasn't that a great time? I've never heard anyone share a negative thought about our dinner for 8. Anyway, hospitable. Verse 16, humility. So much today is based on conceit. I'm an influencer. Take a look at this picture of me in my gorgeous new outfit, or I'm on the beach and saying whatever it is. This is my opinion, and if you disagree with me, you're attacking me. That's an aggression. We need to understand we are simply commanded to be humble about who and what we are, modeling our conduct after the Lord himself. And then finally, verse 18, live in peace. Don't we wish people would listen to that? Now, there's an acknowledgement here is that living in peace is not only or not solely up to us. And sometimes it's impossible because other people don't want to be peaceful. But we're only responsible for our conduct. So we live in peace, we respond to evil with good, and we leave the consequences for the Lord who will judge. So all of these characteristics in this final section are contrary to the ways of the world or to the natural man, which is what makes them challenging. But we are claimed to be a transformed people. And so we should be fully prepared to sacrifice what is considered normal because of the greatness of our salvation, the free and generous gift of our God. This is our reasonable response. All right. Our prayer reminders. Oops, I left my